Brilliant. Right, so hello everybody and welcome to the Blue Bricks podcast. My name's Anthony Boyce. For those who don't know me, I'm a contributor to Blue Bricks. I'm also an architectural designer, investor and developer. I have the great pleasure of interviewing Ranjan Bhattacharya today, who is a commercial conversion specialist. He's been doing this since, I think it's 2005, so a bit of skin in the game there, a bit of time spent. He also runs a property meet, Baker Street Property Meet, and is a TV personality on the Property Elevator, so an angel investor. So welcome, Ranjan. Thank you for allowing me to interview you. Just tell us a bit about your background, if you could, please.
Thanks for the nice intro. Yes,
you're welcome.
Pleasure to be here and to have a chat to your listeners and readers. I basically started investing in property in 1990 as a sideline to my corporate job. I did management consultancy for about a decade, and I then went full-time into property investing and developing in 2001. And I focused on London pretty much, North London, and did a lot of conversions of houses, large houses and buildings into flats. And then what happened is that in the early noughties, yields became a little bit challenging. And 2005 was when I did my first commercial to residential conversion type of project, because simply, to put it simply or bluntly, if you like, normal residential property development, if you're keeping them as investment properties buy to let afterwards, the yields weren't stacking up. And the only way I could make them stack up was to take commercial buildings and either partially or fully convert them to residential use. And then I'd find that the yields and the numbers would add up in London. So that's really how I got into commercial conversions. And then in 2013, of course, a lot of what I was doing under planning permission became permitted development. So it became easier.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good point there. You were doing this before it became kind of easy. So, I mean, how did you find your first deal? Was it difficult at the time, having to go through the planning process? Obviously, well, you had a bit of background in investing and developing anyway. I mean, how did you find it in comparison to just standard, I guess, property bashing and buy-to-lets renovations, really?
Anything with planning permission is hard, because it's hard because it's uncertain. You don't really have a clear idea as to whether you're going to get the permission. And even if you've got a good case, you don't know whether the local planning authority is just going to make you go to appeal to test your resolve. So it might take 8 weeks, it might take 18 months, it might take 2 years, you might not get it at all. That is the problem with planning permission, it's that uncertainty. And that's really why few people do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think you touched on an area there, and I was helping an investor recently with a retail or a shop commercial. We were going to convert the uppers, and we went in for planning purely because we needed to change the shop fronts. When the planner, well, it wasn't the planner, it was the environmental health officer. They caused a stink basically about access to the bins at the back of the property. So we actually withdrew the application and went in under permitted development. Didn't have to provide bin stores, bike stores, or anything like this, and it sailed through. So yeah, it is a much easier process, isn't it, when you compare the two?
Yes.
I mean, for myself, I mean, there's a few other differences between them or benefits. I mean, for example, fees. I mean, how do they differ? Do you know much about the?
Dramatically. We just put in an application to convert an office building into 8 flats. And the planning fee, that's the fee you pay to the council, not the architect, but the fee you pay to the council is £96.
Yeah.
And that's changing. The current PD rules, a lot of them are going to change on July the 31st, 2021. And we're expecting a more per flat application fee as opposed to per application, which is what it is now.
Yeah. I mean, from what I've read on the subject, it's still dramatically less than a planning application. So, I mean, just in
Yes.
terms of fees, a planning application you'd maybe pay £400. Is it about 400 or 300 per unit? Whereas the permitted development is around 100 per unit. So you're talking a quarter less in just your upfront planning costs there as well.
Yes.
So yeah, dramatically
But
cheaper.
they're making you do a lot more surveys nowadays with permitted development. So, I mean, at the moment, like with office to residential conversions, you have to demonstrate that noise from neighboring commercial properties won't have an adverse effect on your future residential occupiers. So you have to get, sometimes you have to get an acoustics report. Some guy comes around with some sound measuring equipment and produces a 40-page report with a whole bunch of pretty graphs, charges you a couple of grand, and that helps your case.
Yeah. So on that, are there any other common consultants you might require if you're going to submit one of these applications for prior approval or permitted development?
With prior approval, it's really a planning consultant as opposed to an architect, because it's not about the design. It's about ticking the right boxes in the permitted development order that will get you the permission. And then afterwards, you can get that nicely designed and all the rest of it. So like the tick boxes are, every habitable room must have natural light. So if you're doing a layout of a flat, when you put in the lounge and the bedroom, they must have natural light windows. Kitchens and bathrooms don't need to have it. I mentioned the considering noise impact. If it's on the ground floor, you can't do it in a flood zone, so you have to get a flood report. What I mean, so let me rephrase that. You can do it in a flood zone. You have to make sure you've got a flood expert to design mitigation measures, flood barriers and the like. So there are a bunch of things you have to take into account. But this is the job of the planning consultant, to make sure you tick all the boxes.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you mentioned there was, I mean, similar to the scheme I mentioned earlier, is you can get your prior approval and basically you can't alter the external of the building. So you could get the design and layout through, but maybe have no access to the actual upper units, which you then have to go back to gain planning for. Obviously, they can't throw it out because you've got permission to convert these uppers. So it's a bit of a strange way of working the system in my eyes, but yeah, I suppose it's easier to do once you do have that permission in place. So you mentioned,
I do get it though. I do get it, because what they're trying to do is say, right, if you preserve the external envelope and you just change the use inside, then whatever you're doing is not having an adverse impact on the neighboring surroundings. That's essentially what they're saying. Yeah. If you want to change the external appearance, then go for planning. The only PD that allows you to change the external envelope, of course, is Class M, which is changing ground floor retail space into residential space. You are actually allowed to make external changes to make the conversion to residential viable. So for example, if you need to put in a window or if you need to put in a door for access, you can do so under Class M. But that's one of the reasons Class M is not allowed in a conservation area. If that makes sense. So it's lovely, really, because they've created all these different rules, and they've created all these, some you can do in a conservation area, some you can't, and there's this and that and the other. So it's not entirely obvious. And for a lot of people who don't really equip themselves with the knowledge, there's doubt. You know, will I get PD, permitted development? Will I not? Will this qualify? Will it not? But if you know the stuff, you know exactly which properties will get it, really, before you've even bought or applied.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, you mentioned before about the access to natural light. I think this is a recent change, is it not? Because I've seen schemes where there was maybe a bedroom at the back of a converted room. with mechanical ventilation. Is that a recent change with the sort of minimum space standards?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing with PD. They come in, and you got to get in first, and you got to have some fun. But there are people that do extreme PD and really mess it up for the rest of us. The natural light thing wasn't actually extreme PD. It was normal PD, just misrepresented by the media. Now, let me explain what I mean. There was this case in Watford of this warehouse where a light industrial building, where people are converting it into a number of flats, but the flats didn't have any windows, and they got their prior approval. And this was all over the newspapers saying, shock, horror, how could they do this? Flats with no windows, what's going on? But what the papers failed to report was that they put in the prior approval for the conversion of the building into flats. And they also put in a planning application to punch in some windows and doors in the exterior. So it wasn't their intention to ever build flats with no windows. It's just that under the prior approval, you can only do internal changes. You can't change the external envelope. Now, that's just a very, very common tactic. But when it got represented in the media and all the national press picked it up, they forgot to mention the planning application to punch in the windows and doors and said, shock, horror, greedy developers, what are they doing? Building flats with no windows. And that's what led the headlines. And of course, headlines get read by voters and politicians react to what voters get upset about. And the next thing you know, they come up with this natural light thing. So this is a little bit unfortunate because there are loads of buildings where you can punch in a few windows and it would give you a better scheme. So the tactic there is simply to reverse things a little bit. You would, if you have an office building, while it's an office, you would apply then for planning permission to punch in some doors, some windows, extra windows. And then once you have implemented that planning permission, in other words, put in those windows, then you would apply for prior approval to do the change of use into flats, because those windows are already in situ. So you'd have to change things around a little bit and delay the scheme a little bit in order to get the result that you want, if windows are important.
Perfect.
I mean, of course, windows are important. I mean, if you have got too few windows in your building.
Yeah, yeah, that's brilliant. So I know some of the most recent changes have made it easier to basically change. They've removed all of this, class A, 1, 2, 3, B.
Oh, yeah.
And basically put them all in as a group being class E. Do you foresee there being another change and just allowing a broad class E to kind of the C3 dwelling usage?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And first of all, class E is massive, and it's a real enabler because it allows buildings to be repurposed to other commercial uses. And people have not grasped what Class E means because as soon as it came out, people digested it, and then COVID shut down kind of hit. So what it means is that, and it will really come about, the benefits of it will become very apparent over the coming years when we get out of COVID. For example, I've got a newsagent, pre-Class E. If I want to convert that into a restaurant, I'd have to go to the planning authorities and get change of use, and they'd usually reject it. Now, if I've got a newsagent and no one wants to rent that shop as a newsagent, but I've got a restaurant that wants to occupy it, then I don't have to ask the council for any permission at all. It's all within the same usage class now, so I can convert from one to the other. I know of a former GP practice in Islington where they've been in a planning battle for 3 years with the council, because Lidl wanted to convert it into a store, and the council rejected. It went to appeal and this, that, and the other. Then Class E came along. Stuff you, council. We can do this straight away. We don't have to ask anybody. If the landlord wants to rent a defunct GP surgery to a supermarket, and they're two willing parties, who are the council to stand in their way? What's it got to do with them anyway? So that frees up now repurposing of commercial buildings to other commercial uses. And what is coming, because they did a consultation paper on this in January, and they're likely to release it in the coming months. They have to release it before July the 31st anyway. But what's coming is permitted development, which allows all of Class E properties to be repurposed to residential use. Now, let's just take a moment to figure out what that means, because before you had PD to do offices to residential, you had PD to do A1 and A2 to residential, and also space above A1 and A2 to residential. But if you had an A3 restaurant, there was no permission to convert the upstairs into flats under PD. If you had a doctor's surgery or dentist practice, there was no PD rights to convert any of that into residential under PD. Now, because all of these property types are now under one usage class, they're saying, hey, you will be able to convert these into residential usage, and they are gonna allow this in a conservation area.
Yeah, I think that's the one of the big gains, isn't it? Whereas you were tied to specific properties now. I think where I am in my office today, I mean, this is a conservation area on the street, so allowing things like residential above the uppers and things like that is a massive boom for I guess these kind of properties that I'm looking at out the window. So on that, I noticed as well there's a few extra property types that have been kind of included in this consultation. Things like industrial units, sports halls, and this kind of thing. I mean, where do you see that going then? I mean, to me, adding residential to a big industrial unit in an industrial park, I'm just trying to get my head around how the planners would try and stop that anyway.
Yeah, I'm kind of there's PD and there's PD. There's some PD that has been talked about, like, for example, the stuff you're talking about, and also adding extra floors on top of existing buildings. They're calling those things PD, but there's so many ifs and buts and checklist items. And it's not just checklist items, but it's areas where the planning authorities can express an opinion.
That's what we want to avoid.
That's what you want to avoid. As soon as they can express an opinion on the look and feel of the building, then it's pretty much planning all over again. So there's some PD prior approval that I am excited about, and there's some that I think is really planning permission, it just given another name.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think the one there with the kind of sports halls, indoor sports areas and that kind of thing, I guess there's an argument for community assets, isn't there, with that one? So I can't see how that one would go through, to be honest.
And you've got a windows issue. You often have they're
just big open spaces, aren't they?
Fast spaces, yeah. Mm-hmm. Fast spaces, no windows, no natural light.
So you mentioned there about the 2 stories above existing offices and that kind of thing. I mean, this one, especially in my network, everybody was really buzzing about this. I mean, do you know of any schemes that have been implemented, or have you tried?
No,
no,
not yet. Again, the council is allowed so much leeway on the look and feel of the building that it's more or less planning.
Yeah.
So I don't fully get that one.
Yeah. One area from obviously doing my research, I feel like I know you already. I've watched that many videos of you in the last sort of few weeks. One of the videos touched upon, I think it was converting, because under current regulations or permitted development, you can change the upper floors above a shop into 2 separate flats.
Yes.
You then, I think you called it blending the yield in order to basically maximize the cash you're going to get from it by turning it from then 2 flats into 2 under licensed levels HMOs.
Yes.
Are there any pitfalls or things to look out for then, or is it just it's just basically as soon as you get C3, you'll then have the option to change it to C4 from there?
You can do that at the moment. It is very likely that after July 31st, 2021, the option to then subsequently convert these properties into HMOs, C4, won't be there.
Right.
So that is a feature of the current system, but I think it says in the consultation paper that they won't really allow that. But I think the thing with HMOs is that I'm not sure whether that's the best route anyway, because HMOs, the regulation on HMOs is going up and up and up all the time, and you've got local authority licensing and stuff like that. So if let's take the example that you talked about where you've got a retail premises. So you can make 2 flats above under Class G, and you can do 1 or more flats at the rear of the shop under what they call Class M. So let's say you take a shop and uppers, you make 2 flats on the ground floor and 2 flats above. That's 4 flats. If they're 1-bedroom flats, they all have their separate council taxes. They all are completely separate dwellings. So what you have is the benefit of a building in multiple occupation. In other words, multiple rental units under one rooftop, which is what an HMO is. But you don't have because they're all self-contained and individual planning units, you have the benefit of a building in multiple occupation, but you don't have any of the hassles of having licensing and HMO compliance and stuff like that, because each of the flats are completely self-contained and they're completely individual planning units. And that's very, very powerful. I think it's one thing that people are missing. So I mentioned earlier on that we're doing this scheme in with eight flats out of an office building. What that is 2 double shops, and there's an office building on the first floor. And we're making that office building into, I mean, some people would have done fewer larger flats and made them into HMOs, but our preference is to do 8 1-bedroom flats, all about 30 square meters, nice size, and rent them out individually, because the whole building then is not an HMO. You've got 8 individual separate planning units. So you completely outside of any HMO rules and regulations and that kind of thing, but you've achieved the yields that you get from having a multi-unit building.
Great, thank you very much. So with the developments at the moment with coronavirus, obviously business premises closing, a shift to maybe more home working, I mean, where do you see the opportunity with commercial premises in the coming years? I mean, to me, I guess you're going to say the same. It seems like boom time for savvy investors like ourselves. Where do you see the opportunities then in the coming years?
I think no, you're right. There's a lot of change with COVID. There's a lot of change that was happening before that's been accelerated and that kind of thing. The retail market, the retail properties, it's not all dead. It's going to be a massive challenge for the big indoor shopping centres, because those sort of places are very, very hard to repurpose. Debenhams, for example, have shut down. If you think about the average Debenhams store, they were designed for selling products off shelves. So how do you repurpose a 90,000 square foot Debenhams store with no windows apart from at the front on multiple levels? How do you make that into residential or something like that when it's in the middle of a shopping center? So I think what we're going to see with those sort of buildings is where they're in prosperous areas and there is affluent footfall, they will get repurposed to other leisure facilities. Places like Westfield in London have started putting indoor golf and stuff in there. So you will get that sort of repurposing where there's the affluence of footfall in that vicinity. The problem will be with the shopping centres, which are in some less prosperous areas, and they can't get anyone to fill those spaces, and they're not easily repurposable to alternative uses. That's going to be the challenge. The high street, though, and secondary parades, it's again, it depends so much on how prosperous the footfall is. In areas where there is relatively affluent footfall, what you're going to see is a lot of space above and behind shops and in surrounding offices are going to get converted to residential use. We're seeing that the footfall in the high street is actually going up, but the kind of stuff they want to do there is not the kind of stuff people did 10 years ago. They're getting their food deliveries online. They're not interested in that. They're interested in services, experiences, eating out. That's what they're interested in. And more of those sort of shops will end up being repurposed to that kind of way. I mean, one thing I've noticed in lockdown is down our local parade of shops, everything might be shut, but everyone's walking around with a branded cup of coffee. You know, they're walking up and down the high street. They're still keen to get out, but it's either a purple cup for Costa or it's a blue cup for Cafe Nero. You know, they're walking around with one of those two cups, going into whatever shops they can. But I don't see people obviously buying products. I mean, the product model has moved on. Most shops that I've been to try to buy something never have what I want in stock, or never have the variety that I can find online. So people have just stopped doing that. So what's happening now is that because of Class E, it is far easier to repurpose some of these buildings without going back to planning authorities for their say-so or tick. And that's going to be very, very powerful indeed. It might sound strange to you, but within my network, there are people who are renting shops to restaurants right now during COVID. What these tend to be are established business operators. It's people with some existing outlets in their chain, if you like. And what I tend to find that in these sort of recessionary times, businesses that have gone into COVID very strong, with a strong business model and a good product, and they're well run, they actually use these times to expand and grow. When we had the last recession in 2009, you know, people like Costa, for example, Greg's, these were two businesses that used that recession time to massively expand their network and grow by one store a week type thing. And what we will see coming out of COVID is a similar thing. There are a number of very strong businesses who would love to get into affluent footfall areas with a service sector offering. You know, right now, for example, there's a huge opportunity in picking. I mean, there are several areas in the southeast, in particular, and in other parts of the country, where a parade of shops has over time become just all restaurants. It's pretty much, we all live somewhere where we know that if we go to town X, there's so many restaurants there, you don't necessarily know what you're going to eat out but you walk up and down the street, you look at the menus in all the windows, and you pick somewhere. Now, if you wanted to open up a restaurant, what better place to open it up on than a street like that? But if there's a newsagent there, nestled between a few restaurants, and that wants to shut down, under the old system, that would stay empty because they could only let it to another person that wanted to sell products. Now, you can buy that shop and you can rent it to someone who wants to put in a restaurant without going to anyone for permission. Mm. So we're going to see a lot of retail, you know, which represents a terrific opportunity. Betting shops. The government has introduced some changes to the laws, which makes, I mean, the betting, I can't remember what the name of the association is, but there's an association of betting shops in the UK, and they said that 60% of UK betting shops are unviable. because they can't use these fixed odd betting terminals anymore in the same way that they used to. So a lot of betting shops are closing. Think of a betting shop. They're not like the Debenham stores. They're not massive with no windows. They're normally a smallish shop with a couple of floors above, very, very easy to repurpose under PD. The ground floor unit, is easily repurposable to another commercial use. Now, a lot of people who bought betting shops, landlords, bought those as very stable, rock solid commercial buy-to-let investments. If you had a shop and you had William Hill or Coral as a tenant for 10 years, that was safe as anything, and you didn't want to do any development or anything like that. You just banked that in your pension and sat back and enjoyed the passive income. Yeah. Now those landlords are facing a little bit of anxiety. There's 2 years left on the lease. The William Hill, Coral are probably not going to renew. They never got into commercial property as a development ploy. They only got into it because they just wanted stable cash flow. So suddenly they're looking to sell, and you see this all the time. You only have to look at some of the commercial property auctions and see how many bank buildings as well.
I was going to mention banks because,
exactly, they're all over the place. 10 years ago, if you were a landlord, no one would sell a bank building. They would come up very, very rarely. And when they did come up for sale, it would always say, first time on the market in 35 years. It would be that sort of sale. Why would you sell? They're there forever. But now, of course, the people that own them only own them because it was stable cash flow. And now they're facing, got HSBC as a tenant, the lease ends in 2023. What do I do? Might as well sell now. Yeah. So that's why there's so much opportunity, because the people that own a lot of these properties never bought them to get into development. They bought them for commercial buy-to-let. It's with a lot of these properties, they're not going to produce that commercial buy-to-let unless they are repurposed in some way. And that's where the investor developer can come in and play a part. Because the big developers ain't interested. Even if you look at the average Barclays Bank building in your high street, that's not something that Barratt Homes is going to sweep down and mess around repurposing. They were interested in the and this is the other thing I say. Repurposing commercial buildings has gone on forever. There used to be loads of commercial buildings on canal sides, and then the railways came in and people repurposed them. And then, the whole of Camden Market used to be stables for 10,000 horses. And then the motor car came in and that was repurposed. And then in the early 80s, of course, manufacturing moved abroad, and a load of factories, Docklands, places like that, they were all repurposed into residential units. Now, who led the charge with that repurposing? It was the large developers. Why? Because these were 10,000, 20,000 square foot buildings. It wasn't a small-time developer investor who could do them. Look at the size of the average betting shop in your local high street. That's not something that the big developer is going to be interested in. It's too small fry. So for the first time, really, we're looking at a whole-scale repurposing of commercial buildings where the big developers aren't interested because it's too small fry for them. Before, every repurposing of commercial buildings has really been only a big developers only type thing. The little developers couldn't play. Yeah. So that's why it's a very, very exciting time.
Absolutely. So on that then, there's obviously two schools of thought here. With the pandemic, I guess everyone on forums and that kind of thing is expecting property prices or commercial property prices to fall. But with the changes to Class E, what would you see? Is it going to stabilise? Do you see a dip in commercial values in the short term, or do you think the ability then just to flip and change between different uses of retail, cafes, that kind of thing, is that going to hold the values up?
No, I mean, yes and no. Here's the thing. Here's the thing. Commercial values are dictated by the rent roll. You know, have you got a decent tenant in there, meaning a big company or long lease, and how much rent they're paying. A mixture of those sort of things determines the value of the property. So if you've suddenly got, say, a William Hill in there and the lease ends in 2 years and then they aren't renewing, or you have a vacant commercial property which is not generating any income, then it's very difficult to value it. And coupled with that, lenders, long-term commercial mortgage lenders, don't want to lend on properties that don't have a stable tenant with a stable cash flow, because that's what they use to value it. But so that creates a massive problem in valuing commercial properties, and that puts downward pressure on those commercial assets. But PD creates an alternative, and yes, you can do PD, but still the commercial lenders really they don't want an idea, they don't want a possibility. What they want is a fully baked loaf of bread. When it's fully baked, and in other words, you've converted it, you're generating cash flow from it, it's fully let, then the commercial lender will come in and say, great, these are the tenancies, this is the cash flow, we value it at this, simple stuff, we'll lend you this on the property. But until that's done, they're pretty much not interested. So we have this situation where a lot of commercial property, if it's valued on their current cash flow, is technically valued quite low, but it's got the potential to be this. Mm-hmm. So you tend to find that they can be picked up for just around that sort of level. And depending on supply, demand, and how obvious the PD is, the price goes up. If the PD angle to convert it just stares you straight in the face and it's obvious to anyone, then of course there's more competition for that commercial property, and therefore the price is up. A good example of that is office to residential conversions. I mean, everyone knows about office to residential conversions. These days, a lot of vendors will apply for prior approval and sell their property with the prior approval in place for the conversion into flats. Yeah. And when people do that, you tend to find the price that they want for it is a little bit higher than if it was just a raw, empty, vacant commercial building. So it's hard to value vacant buildings, because commercial buildings are and that's the key difference between residential and commercial, because if I have an empty flat, it has a value. A buy-to-let lender will lend on an empty flat because it's bricks and mortar. Yeah. They look at similar flats in the area. What do they sell for? What do they rent for? And value your empty one accordingly. With commercial property, the only thing they use to value the property is the rent roll and the strength of the tenant that's occupying it and the length of their lease.
Brilliant. Great explanation there. So you've sold me, Ranjan. I want to go out and I want to find one of these buildings. Where do I look? Where do you think, for the budding commercial conversion investor, where should they be looking, do you believe, now? On what platforms? You know, is it just Rightmove? You said auctions before, but also what areas of town would you see where the bargains are, I guess?
I think I would stick with connectivity and some level of affluence. You don't want to go into areas that are desolate. By affluence, you really have to measure affluence by the average price of property in the area. The thing is, though, there are some parts of the country where a flat will cost you 40, 50 grand.
Careful, remember I'm up north.
No names mentioned, but there's some areas where if a flat costs you 40, 50 grand and it's going to cost you 40, 50 grand to convert, it ain't just going to happen. And that is the problem with some areas. But there is talk about some government grant and money coming to help with that. So it does help if there's some level of affluence in the area. And my rule of thumb is, the average UK house price is about 250k. If you're at or above 80% of that, so 200k average house price, then you're in an area where this sort of thing should work. And it's not really about where to look for these, because they're all over the place. They're auctions, they're agents, they're just all over the place. It's knowing what to look for. And the key with the commercial strategy is to educate yourself with the knowledge of what makes a good deal. Because, I mean, if you think about residential property, it's not that complicated. I mean, most people that turn up on Homes Under the Hammer make some money, because we all live in a flat or a house. We all live in residential property. And if you look at a 3-bedroom terrace, who can not tell you what the opportunity is? New bathroom, kitchen, liquor paint, put a conservatory at the back, maybe a loft conversion. I mean, all the angles are known to everybody. With commercial property, it's not obvious. It's not obvious what PD applies to that premises. It's not obvious what other commercial uses it can be put to. It's not obvious whether it's worth making the envelope of the building bigger under permitted development to get more rent roll. There's so many things that aren't obvious. It's not obvious whether to split it in some way. So these sort of things are, I say that and the best commercial properties often look but ugly. I mean, if you go on, beautiful houses, and I want to buy sort of beautiful buildings and all of that. I mean, you mentioned the property elevator show. There was a guy that came on that show to pitch for funding for a bank building that he'd bought. And he'd basically fallen in love with it. I mean, it was a beautiful building, but it's a nightmare. Because when you look at a building like that, it's grade 2 listed, conservation area, you've got all these little turrets and stonework to maintain and stuff like that. And it doesn't make sense if you're converting it to a block of flats. And so beautiful building, but the area didn't justify the works involved in converting those into flats. So with commercial property, I think you've got a different set of considerations, quite frankly. And the value is really in the buyer's spreadsheet. That's where it lies. It's the numbers in the buyer's spreadsheet. And that's why a huge amount of learning and knowledge needs to be gathered first before you get into commercial property. Of course, it can be done. I mean, you wouldn't, do a round of golf without taking a few lessons first. Otherwise, you'd just be, losing all your balls in the bush on the side of the holes and all of that. You wouldn't have a clue. It's the same thing I think with residential property, there is an element of you can just dive in and give it a go. But without some education, without some knowledge and learning, you can lose a lot. And for the cost of a little bit of the right education, you can make a lot more rather than lose a lot.
Yeah. You mentioned that. I mean, there's a lot of obviously property training on residential. I guess this would be a good plug for yourself. I mean, you offer. Well, you've got a YouTube channel with certainly a lot of content. I've been watching. I think you put stuff out every week. I mean, is there any way people can learn from yourself in this commercial conversion arena?
Yeah, I mean, we put a lot of stuff on YouTube, but we run some commercial training courses, which are I mean, the key to learning is that whoever you learn from has got to be doing it. And has got to not just done it 5 years ago and recite, great war stories and all of that sort of stuff, but doing it right now and doing it across a range of projects, because commercial conversions is a moving beast. It's something that's changing all the time. So our training is kept up to date. We do an 8-module a 4-week course, which we kind of deliver online. It's proved very, very popular. And what we also run for people that do the course is what I call my commercial academy. And that is basically weekly group coaching for people that have done the course to help them implement it. So the way we do the training is we give you the learning in a set of 8 modules, which tells you the A to Z of how to do, basically how to create wealth through commercial property. And through the week group coaching calls, we show you how to implement it. There's no point learning a bunch of stuff if you do not have help and support in implementing the strategies. And that's where the power is unlocked.
Yeah, it is the accountability part. I find that a lot of people do seem to go on courses and then never implement the action. So I guess having that continual support and kind of the shove, the push in the right direction would be beneficial. So that's brilliant.
Not
Thank
just
you.
that. I think the biggest benefit is that a lot of this commercial conversion stuff is new to people. Commercial property is new to people, and so they do the learning. They do the 8-module course. And then as part of that, you're plugged into the commercial academy for 2 months. So every week we do these group coaching calls. And what people see from the group, they've had the learning, but there's something that invigorates people when they come on the group coaching calls and they see other people just like, it's almost, okay, I do something, that doesn't really matter. But they see someone who had just joined the course 4 weeks ago, and they'd found a deal and the PD is working and they're doing something creative and they're showing their projections that it works. And people are inspired by that success and the progress of their peers who basically started their journey relatively recently with the same learning. And it's kind of, you mentioned that motivation, that accountability. The biggest motivation, I think, is that people start their journey and they come on and they're just like them and they manage to do it. So why can't they, kind of thing? You know, it's and the thing with commercial property, and one thing we do on the group coaching calls is deal analysis clinics, because you've got to go through, when you look at people tell me time and time again that they look at a commercial auction catalog and they're lost. They go through the pages, why would anyone buy that? What's the value there? And you've got to get your skills to a level where you can go through a commercial catalog as though you're on a dating app, swipe left, swipe right, and you can quickly do a swipe left, swipe right on a deal and assess it, and then do the next level of analysis, which just tells you whether it's a go or not. But people don't know what the angles are to do that first pass. And that's where the knowledge comes in, and that's where the practice comes in applying that on analyzing several deals.
Yeah, perfect. No, that's a great list there. So, I mean, just if you're able to tell me, I mean, I guess it's probably a very broad area, but when you are kind of carrying out the sniff test on a deal, I mean, how do you go about analysing how much a conversion would be to flats? I mean, is there a pound per square foot that you would kind of attribute to a conversion, or is it just a cost per unit? What is it you kind of look for and attribute the refurb costs to, I guess?
I think it's not really you can't really come up with a rule of thumb figure for that. You've got to take into account a bunch of factors. I mean, if you're doing new build, you tend to find that the cost to get out the ground to DPC level is the variable element. And then once you're at DPC level, the cost to build a thing is the same wherever, and you can do the cost per square foot and that kind of stuff. But it depends on so much. It depends on, firstly, the state of repair the building is in that you're working with. So how much do you have to fix before you get to a back to brick starting point, if you like, your DPC level equivalent with new build? That might be new roof, moldy joists, flooring that's rotten through, or whatever it is, brickwork that's damp and water penetrating through, repointing, windows, whatever it is. So there's a whole bunch of repair costs, which is unique to that particular property. And then there's a certain amount of work which is bespoke to each building, which is whoever built that building. I mean, when you're converting a building from one purpose to another, whoever built it put in walls for its original purpose. So walls and load-bearing walls are often in the wrong place. So how many of those do you have to move? What beams do you have to put in? What structures do you have to put in? And how much is that going to cost? That is often bespoke for that particular type of property. You also find that the newer the building, the less you generally have to do than an older building. A newer building will have less load-bearing walls. You've got cavity walls, first of all, newer construction. It's much easier to deal with. So there are all sorts of factors that you have to put into play. There might be dangerous stuff as well. Older buildings often have the asbestos. If you're doing office to residential conversion, for example, if you've got I've been a big fan of 1980s and later buildings because they tend to be brick built, they've got lots of windows, and they look easy to convert. The expensive ones are the stuff built in the 1970s, because in the 1970s and late 60s, they did this, this single glazing look, and they had these sort of panels that weren't really brickwork. Now, to make that into residential, you have to put cladding and insulation, so you have to do so much to the envelope of the building before you can start the conversion. And then you may have asbestos partitions in there and all that sort of stuff. But if you've got a 1980s brick-built building, it's pretty much strip out and crack on. So I'm not saying that don't do the older buildings. The older buildings make sense in a higher value area. If my flat sells for 400 grand a piece, then it's worth spending 80 grand to remove asbestos. But if I'm in an area where the flats are selling at 60 grand a piece, I don't really want I want a building that has no repairs, no load-bearing walls, nothing to do, I don't have any modifications to do with the external envelope. I can pretty much strip out and crack on because the floor plate is nice and simple. Otherwise, it's going to be uneconomic. So the stuff to learn is the factors that go in, because the mistake that a lot of people make is that they look for a rule of thumb rather than look for how to look, whereas the proper approach is to learn that conversion costs are a sliding scale, and it's learning the factors that decide where on that sliding scale your property project fits. That's it. If you look for a rule of thumb, you end up doing one of two things, and both are a disaster. You end up either overestimating the costs, and that means you won't do the deal. You think it's going to cost 300 grand to do the conversion work because someone else comes along and will do it for 150. That means they have bought the deal because they've properly estimated costs, and you have passed the deal by thinking, who is that nutter? Why have they overpaid for that property? And of course, the other side of it is you underestimate the job completely, and then you come a cropper when the build works come in. But if you do rules of thumb, the possibility that never happens is you get it bang on right. That doesn't seem to happen.
Yeah. Well, one area you mentioned there was the asbestos. I mean, have you employed a capital allowances surveyor at any point to basically recoup some of the money spent on these issues that you found in properties? I know there's like land remediation, there's asbestos and things like that. Have you?
Yeah, I mean, capital allowances should always be seen as icing on the cake, because if there is fixed infrastructure in a building, for example, you're buying an office building, it'll have a lift, it'll have air conditioning, it'll have fire alarms and stuff like that. So anything that's fixed in infrastructure, which is embedded in the fabric of the building, you can claim capital allowances for, and that's icing on the cake. So normally we'd pick up a building and then get a capital allowances surveyor to come in and have a look at that. There are some great circumstances where if the previous owner has basically invested in the property and made some capital improvements and have not claimed the capital allowances, then they can pass on those capital allowances to you when you buy the property. And that can be very, very powerful. And another thing that a lot of people don't know about is charities can't claim capital allowances. So if you're buying a building off a charity and they have put in capital spend, then it's no skin off their nose to transfer their capital allowances to you on purchase, because they haven't claimed them. They can't claim them by law anyway.
Good little secret there then to look for as well. So at the flip side, then we've converted the building. How do you assess the sale price of the commercial? Obviously, we mentioned the more the residential side. We've mentioned the commercial goes on the strength of the lease or the tenant you've put in downstairs. How would you go about assessing whether it's sale price per square foot or the GDV, I guess, of the scheme you're putting
That's a good
forward?
question. It's all down to comparables.
Mm-hmm.
And when you've converted to residential, you at the best you can hope for is the equivalent of any comparable residential property in a neighboring side street. But usually it's a discount off that. Now, when you've done your commercial conversion to residential, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. What I mean by that is if you've got an office building and you're lucky enough that when you've converted it into residential, it looks as though it was always residential, then there'll be no difference in the price of those apartments from neighboring apartments. But if it's still above commercial or behind commercial, or it just looks as though it's a former commercial building, then you will not get the same price as you would do from an equivalent flat in a dedicated residential building. And then you'd have to apply a discount. So for example, if you've got a flat above a busy shop on a busy high street, then you'd be looking at a good 20% discount off an equivalent flat in a neighboring residential side street. And it's a bit of a sliding scale depending on how much of a compromise you're making in terms of having commercial occupiers, or it obviously looking like a former commercial building, or it is a commercial building compared to a fully residential building. It's on that sort of sliding scale, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good to know. Thank you.
You know, we talked about office buildings. You know, some of the best office buildings are the ones that were in the 1980s. They had a little design phase where a lot of office buildings were put up and they were brick built, and they actually looked like blocks of flats. You know, you do office to resi conversion of those, and if it's not in an area where it's, you know, surrounded by other offices, then it pretty much looks as though it was always residential, and he quids in with those.
Good stuff. So, we found it. We've worked out our GDV. We've got our build price. How would you go about, I guess, securing one of these deals? Then, are there any creative ways you can do this? I mean, how would you go about funding it or finding a lender? And I guess, can these produce that holy grail of property with an all money out or a no money down kind of strategy when you come to the end of these developments?
The holy grail, definitely yes, and I think it's the only way. Well, it's one of the few ways in town that's pretty much it's pretty straightforward. The reason it's straightforward is that you take commercial real estate, and it's often a third of the prices of residential real estate. So you've got that equity to draw on when you've done the conversion in order to pull your money out and pretty much have no money tied up in the deal. So you've got that sort of structure. But financing, creative financing, this is something that I cover extensively on my training programs. And what all the techniques boil down to is delaying the transaction. You secure the deal, you find the deal, and you secure it with the vendor. And then you commit to buying it, but you don't complete the purchase. And you use the time between committing on the purchase to actually buying it to get your prior approval official. So you put in your prior approval application for flats or whatever, and you get that piece of paper that says, hey, you can do it. At that stage, you have increased the value of the property through planning gain. And at that stage, you can complete on the purchase and get a valuer from, say, a bridging company to value the property at its enhanced value, not necessarily the purchase price. So creative financing is really about a whole bunch of tools and techniques to slow down the transaction, find the property, commit the vendor at a particular price, get the prior approval, therefore get the value uplifted, complete the purchase using a bridging lender to fund the purchase of the property at its uplifted value, complete the purchase, do the works, get it cash flow positive, refinance at the higher value to a long-term lender and keep it, or some people choose to sell it at that point. But that's the simplest way. Of course, people do JVs and private investors. There's no shortage of private investors right now looking to escape virtually zero interest rates. But creative financing is the main.
That's brilliant. Well, I think we've walked through from what PD is, or prior approval, all the way through to finding, developing, and I guess revaluing, refinancing the deal. So I guess we'll call it a day there. So thank you very much for your time. That's been I've really enjoyed that. I think there's a lot of takeaways just for myself. So hopefully everyone else finds some value in that as well. So I guess how do people get in touch with you, Ranjan? How can they sort of learn more? How do they find you on YouTube? How do they get in touch with your training and that kind of thing, please?
Everything's on succeedinproperty.com. Succeedinproperty.com is the website. And if you search Succeed in Property on YouTube, you'll find our YouTube channel. We put out new videos weekly. And we do a lot of case studies as well. I'm vlogging a lot of the current projects that I'm doing as well. Permitted development, commercial conversions. If you want to find out about those, they're all on YouTube.
Brilliant. Well, I think we'll call it a day there. So thank you very much for your time, Ranjan. That was a brilliant chat. So I've been Anthony Boyce. We'll put contact details in the comments, I'd imagine, as well. So thank you for joining us, and I hope we talk again.
Thank you.